Hello and welcome to the last session of the event. Have you guys had a good time so far? I hope so. Hope it's been good for you. My name is Dan Holme, and as you can tell from my accent, I come from the United States. In fact, I live in Hawaii on the island of Maui, so I flew in day before yesterday, halfway around the world, and if I sound a little hoarse, it's because I picked up a cold on the airplane. But it's my pleasure to be with you here today and to share with you my insights into best practices in administering Active Directory. A little bit about myself. I have spent 17 years as a consultant, an author, and a trainer serving global Fortune 500 size organizations. The one I can talk about in public is NBC Television, which is one of the major networks in the US, for whom I'm the Microsoft Technologies consultant during the broadcast of the Olympic Games. And so I've been involved in Torino, Beijing, Vancouver, and now we're getting ready for London. And that involves implementing many of the best practices that we're going to be talking about here today. I also have my own consulting firm, Intellium. I'm the chief evangelist for SharePoint for a company called AvePoint. And I'm an author for Microsoft Press. My book is listed up there. And for those of you who will be administering Active Directory, I highly recommend this book solely because it's one of the few books out there that tells you how to do things that you can't do out of the box with Active Directory. So many of the tricks I'll be showing you today, if you like them, there's a lot more in that particular resource. My email address is up here as well, and I encourage you to always feel comfortable to email me. My job is to help the community do better with the technology, so I'm more than happy to answer questions whenever I can. And I will be posting the slides and the scripts to my SkyDrive later on today or perhaps tomorrow. So the URL is there, and I will tweet that URL right after the session. My Twitter handle is @DanHolme. So with that, we've got about 53 minutes to cram in about 20 years worth of, or 10 years worth of the industry's experience with Active Directory. I began working with Active Directory in 1998 when it was Windows NT 5.0 Alpha. And then, of course, Active Directory came out with Windows 2000 in production. And since then, a lot has changed. And you all are entering a really exciting time in the world of Active Directory. Things have changed. Things are changing even faster. And I want to help you understand, first of all, what has changed over the 10 years that have passed, so that when you hear people and you see people implementing practices that are old, that you know how to do it better. And also you know why it was done that way in the past, so that you can help your employers and your enterprises do better. So we'll start with Active Directory design, building a domain in a forest from the ground up, and then we will also spend a lot of time with tricks and tips for how you can go beyond the out-of-box tool set and administer Active Directory more effectively. So the first thing we'll talk about in your Active Directory is the domain controllers themselves. When you install Active Directory on a domain controller, you should really try to keep your domain controllers clean. That means don't have your domain controller doing other things. That makes it a bigger security risk. It adds risk for updates, and so keep your domain controllers clean and doing their jobs. And one way you can help that happen is leveraging virtualization. Virtualization is obviously the way of the future, and in the case of domain controllers, you can virtualize a domain controller and thereby keep that virtual machine focused on the one task of supporting your Active Directory. So even in a small business where maybe you have very few servers, instead of having your domain controller be a file server and a print server and an exchange server, instead put your domain controller in a virtual machine and allow other roles to be hosted either on the physical box or on other virtual machines. Another thing you can do to help out the security of your domain controllers is to use read-only domain controllers, which allow you to put a domain controller in a physical location that is less secure. So if you have a remote office, for example, you can put a read-only domain controller there, and it will be able to authenticate users, but if it gets compromised, that domain controller cannot infect and corrupt the rest of your directory. Now, the one piece of advice I'll give you about remote read-only domain controllers is that you must be sure you've tested them in production before you expect them to work. There are some applications out there, some third-party applications and services that weren't really coded correctly. They don't work effectively against read-only domain controllers. And the only way to know that is to actually test it. So read-only domain controllers are a great feature. Microsoft is right to talk about the value that they provide, but do make sure that you're confident they will work for you in production. Up to the domain level itself, I'd like to talk about forest and domain design, because 10 years ago when people started with Active Directory, the design goals were quite different than they are now. And so let me actually whiteboard this here and we'll describe it. In the early days of Active Directory, it was common to use multi-domain forests, where you would have a single domain and then you would have child domains within a single forest. And your forest might even be just 2 domains. And this top domain was often called an empty forest root, where it would be a domain without any real users or computers or resources, but it would represent the enterprise, whereas all of the real users and computers would be in child domains, 1 or more child domains. The design concept at the time was that Active Directory would eventually allow us to merge with another company and simply take their domain and graft it to our forest. That capability never came out, and so the potential that a multi-domain forest and an empty domain root has generally not been realized in the community. In fact, what we found over the years of experience is that as soon as you have more than 1 domain in your forest, you actually make security and manageability much more difficult. So multi-domain forests are really out, and instead you really should design a single domain, and within that domain secure the service accounts, secure the major administrative accounts effectively in order to isolate them rather than put them in a separate domain. Another thing that used to be very common is if we had our company, Company A, and we were partnered with another company, Company B, we would create trusts between those domains, Windows trusts. And Windows trust relationships would allow us to have user accounts from our partner company, and we could assign those accounts permissions to a resource in our domain, as long as we trusted that domain. That was a very common model for many, many years, even going back before Active Directory. And these days, that model is starting to break down for a number of reasons. First of all, it is difficult to secure perfectly. Then there are a couple of features that you can add, including selective authentication and advanced encryption of the trusts to make them more secure. However, it still involves going through firewalls with ports that most companies aren't comfortable opening up. And so the new world is really about federating identity and using Active Directory federated services and similar authentication services to authenticate users rather than Windows trusts. So with Active Directory federated services, you can authenticate users against a partner domain using standard protocols and ports and a set of standard services. So keep your eye on Active Directory federated services. It's part of Active Directory. It is now in version 2. It's a very important technology, and my guess is that in Windows 9, we're going to see that Active Directory looks a lot more like Active Directory Federated Services does today, and a lot less than Active Directory looks like today. The world is moving towards claims-based authentication, and I believe that that's where Microsoft will end up taking the product as well, just as an industry observer. So old school domains, old school trusts are really out, and you really should be looking at single domain forests, and when you need to partner with another organization, look at identity federation with tools like Active Directory Federated Services. Within a single domain, within your domain, you have to think about your design of your organizational units, and this is where we will jump into a real domain here. When you design your Active Directory, and you look at the structure of organizational units, you want to be sure that you've designed your organizational units to manage security first. Now, the reason I emphasize that is in the early days of Active Directory, people would also design Active Directory to support group policy. And they would create OUs solely so that they could link a group policy object to the OU. And that has turned out to be, in most cases, a less than effective design. So let's take a look at an actual Active Directory design here. If we go into our domain, we can see that the organizational units are really focused on object classes. For example, we see user accounts and servers. The reason that it's important to design Active Directory for security is that permissions must be propagated through the directory. You're going to assign permissions on this OU, for example, that your help desk can reset user passwords. And you want that permission to be propagated effectively through the objects in your Active Directory. So rather than splitting out user accounts, we put user accounts in a location that allows our help desk to have a single point of delegation, and we can manage that delegation and those permissions effectively. When we look inside these OUs, we'll see a little bit more detail. For example, in our client computers OU, we have the ability to assign universal permissions. For example, we might have, again, a centralized help desk that is able to perform tasks for any computer. But we might also have regional offices. For example, an office in London or an office in Sydney. And we have help desks, we have a local desktop support there. And we want that local desktop support to be able to join a machine to the domain, for example. By creating an OU to delegate that permission to, we've given ourselves an effective way to delegate one time to that local desktop support group. So it's quite common to see an OU for client computers that's divided into regions to reflect the local desktop support delegation needs. When we look at something like the servers OU, this is something you would see that would be fairly common, where each type of server is in its own OU, because typically there are teams of administrators who manage those servers. And so they can be given permissions to their OU to do things like join a server to the domain. So we end up finding that object-based models often reflect the delegation needs of businesses. So this is a very common model, but the real point is that you need to focus on delegation and on the assigning of permissions and making it as simple and effective as possible, because that's what Active Directory is really designed to do as a database, is create a structure through which permissions can be propagated. Now when it comes to group policy, when you get down into your design after you have designed it for security, you might find that you have an OU that you can link a group policy to, and that's great. If your design also supports group policy, that's excellent. But as we'll see in a moment, most organizations have found that it's more effective and more manageable to work with group policies by filtering them to a group rather than linking them to an OU. So for example, if we go up to our group policy management, we can see that at the level of our domain, we've linked OUs. For example, we've linked group policies. For example, a group policy that deploys Adobe Acrobat or that deploys VLC Player. These group policies are linked to the domain and filtered to a group, so that in order to, when we want a user or a computer to receive these applications, we put them into the group, and it doesn't matter where in the domain they're located. Because a computer or a user can only live in one organizational unit, but it can belong to multiple groups. So most organizations have found that filtering group policies based on group membership is a more effective way to manage group policies. Let me take a quick look and, yeah. So let's move on to the concept of group policy. Group policies. And we've just been talking about scoping group policies. And scoping group policies is the concept of deciding how a group policy object applies to your environment. And you can scope a group policy several different ways. You can scope a group policy based on linking it to a site, a domain, or an organizational unit. But that, and in some cases that works, but in most cases it's not really flexible or manageable enough. You can also scope a group policy based on WMI filters, and WMI filters allow you to query the hardware and determine whether a group policy applies. So for example, we could say, apply this group policy only if a machine has more than 2 gigabytes of RAM, or if it has 20 gigs of free hard disk space. WMI filters are interesting, they're effective, but they're the most performance-intensive way of filtering group policy objects. Because if you use a WMI filter, the computer, the client, has to actually run that query during the group policy application process, which can take time. So the best practice is not to use WMI filters unless you have something that is truly dynamic and is likely to change regularly. So, for example, instead of creating a group policy that uses a WMI filter to decide whether a machine is Windows 7, that's very performance intensive, create a group of computers that are Windows 7. That doesn't change very often. When you upgrade a machine, you can add it to the group, and you then don't need to be running a WMI filter all the time. So groups end up being the most effective way to filter group policy objects. And 2 points about using groups to filter group policy objects. Let's create a new group policy. We'll call this Antwerp Policies. And let's say that we want this group policy to apply to users and computers in Antwerp. Now I've already got a group called, let's see, where is it? Oh, I reset my virtual machine. So we'll create the group first. We'll create a group for Antwerp users and computers. And then when we want to filter this group policy object, by default, a group policy object will apply to all users and computers, the authenticated users group. We remove that, and we add the one group that we do want, Antwerp users and computers. Now, if you do this, this will work for the group policy. The group policy will now only apply to those users and computers, but the problem is an administrator who isn't in that group, when they open the group policy management console, what they will see is something that indicates that this is an unknown group policy. They won't actually be able to see this. They'll see a blank spot in the group policy, which makes it tough for an administrator to work with. It makes it difficult to troubleshoot the group policies. So if you filter a group policy object to apply to only one set of users, you should also go to the Delegation tab and give the authenticated users group read permission. You give that group read permission, but you do not give the group, see if I can find it here, there we go. You do not give the group apply group policy permission. So this policy will not apply, but they will be able to read it. And that simply means that an administrator will be able to see that the group policy exists. In the troubleshooting tools, you won't get messages about unknown group policy objects. So when you do filter a group policy object, do give the authenticated users group read permission. That makes your life a lot easier. The other thing that you want to do with group policies occasionally is you want to deny group policies from applying to a group. So in this case, let's say we've got this group policy object and we want to prevent it from applying to the Antwerp users. In order to do that, we cannot use this user interface. We have to go back to the Delegation tab, to the Advanced button, and we add our Antwerp group, and we deny that group the apply group policy permission. So that's how we block the group policy from applying to a single group. When you do that, unfortunately, it doesn't show up here. So when you look at the group policy object, you can't really tell that it applies to everyone except Antwerp users. You actually have to dig deeper into the user interface to find that, which is unfortunate, but that's the way the interface works. Now, whenever you create a group policy object, I encourage you to have one group created that will allow you to deny that group policy. Even if no one needs to be denied now, there usually comes a time when there's problems that need to be solved. And in troubleshooting, you want to start removing group policy objects from a user or a computer. So my recommendation is every time you create a group policy object, create some kind of group that allows you to deny permissions so that you can exclude a user or computer if necessary from a particular group policy. So we've looked at the domain, we've looked at Active Directory, we've looked at group policies, and we've looked at OUs. Our next step is going to be to look at sites, but before I do that, are there any questions about the pieces we've talked about so far? And if there are, you might have to shout out because I can't necessarily see everybody. Okay? Now on sites. Active Directory sites are let me get my pen out. Active Directory sites are logical objects that represent areas of high connectivity. And these tend to lead to a lot of confusion in organizations because they think, when an organization thinks of the word site, they think, oh, we have a site in Antwerp, and we have a site in Brussels, and we have a site in New York City. So they think about sites geographically. Active Directory sites are logical objects that don't represent a geographic area. They represent an area of high connectivity. So if you have high connectivity in Antwerp and Brussels, those two geographic locations might be a single Active Directory site. But if there's a slower or more expensive link to New York might also be its own Active Directory site. Now, in the early days of Active Directory, the industry was very concerned that Microsoft would bring down their networks with lots of replication traffic. People didn't trust Microsoft to do it right. But what proved is that Microsoft did a very good job in designing Active Directory replication. It's very robust, it's very efficient, and in addition, over time, networks have gotten much better. So the kinds of connectivity we see, even in our own homes, is better than most businesses had 10 years ago. So because both people's understanding of replication has changed and network technologies have improved, we now have a situation where when you look at your environment, you might think, well, we have good connectivity between all of these sites. And if that's the case, we could get by with a single Active Directory site. And many organizations are doing that now because they have such good connectivity. The problem is that sites are for more than replication of traffic. Sites are also used to help locate resources close to you when those resources are replicated and distributed in multiple locations. So, for example, you can have a file server that contains important information in Brussels. And if the information is that important, you might also have it replicated into a server in Antwerp using DFSR, Distributed File System Replication. And you might also have it replicated in New York with DFSR. Now, if users are accessing these resources using DFSN, Distributed File System Namespaces, DFSN will allow you to get users to the closest copy of that resource. The DFSN is site-aware, as are several other technologies within Windows. But if you only have one site, a user in New York might very well connect with the copy of the resource in Antwerp, which might not be so efficient. And so even though you might be able to get by with one site from a replication perspective, you actually find these days you need more sites in order to support localization of services so that users are getting things from the most efficient location. So I've been in a number of companies that are starting to create single sites and then realizing that they need to go and create more sites than maybe they even had before simply to support localization. And in addition, we're finding that when you do that, you create sites that don't have domain controllers. So for example, if Antwerp and Brussels are highly connected, you might have your domain controller only in Antwerp. You may not have a domain controller in Brussels. But you may create two separate sites in order to support localization of a service like DFS. So you end up with sites without domain controllers. And when you do that, you can implement what's called coverage, where you tell the Brussels site that it should use the domain controller in Antwerp rather than the domain controller in New York City. So think about sites as a way of localizing resources. Be aware of what you have out there and what sites are really used for. Related to sites are subnets. Each site is actually defined by the IP addresses that it has. So if we have a range of addresses, like 10.0.1.0, that would define the Antwerp site, and maybe 10.0.2.0 defines Brussels. And it is the linkage between the subnet and the site that allows a computer to know what site it's in, and therefore to get resources more effectively. So if we go in and look at our interface in Active Directory sites and services, we see subnets are defined, and each subnet object is linked, each subnet is linked to one and only one site. So when you, the key takeaway here is that it's very important that every address that a computer might get in your enterprise has a subnet that associates it with a site. Because if a computer gets an IP address that isn't defined as a site, it basically has no clue where it is, and it makes very bad decisions about where to authenticate and where to get resources from. So whenever in a large organization where you have DHCP servers and you're adding scopes to your DHCP servers, it's important that every time you add a scope, you also associate it with a site and have some sort of process to ensure that happens in Active Directory. So those are some tips on sites and subnets. And then finally there is replication. And as I mentioned, replication has proven to be quite good. Our networks are quite fast. And if you have multiple sites, let's go back yet one more time here. If you have multiple sites defined, so we've now defined 3 sites, Antwerp, Brussels, and New York, and we have domain controllers in Antwerp and New York, they are going to replicate with each other using what's called inter-site replication. Within a site, if you've got multiple domain controllers, let's say you've got 2 domain controllers in Antwerp, 2 domain controllers in New York, those domain controllers will replicate with what's called intra-site replication. Now, intra-site replication is very, very, very fast. When a domain controller gets a change, it tells its partners, I've got a change. You want to come get it? And the partners come and get the change. And that usually happens within about 15 or 30 seconds. So replication is very fast using what's called notification-based replication. One domain controller notifies its partner that it has changes. Between sites, it's very different. Between sites, there's a process called polling, where the bridgehead server from one site calls up the bridgehead server from the other site and says, do you have any changes? And that polling can only happen at a minimum of 15 minutes. So there can be a very big time lapse between when a user is added to a group in New York and when that user can actually be part of that group in Antwerp. That time lapse can be very painful, and it really doesn't help much if you have relatively good connectivity. If you have good connectivity between these 2 sites, there's no reason why you should be waiting 15 minutes to get those changes. And what you can do is you can implement what's called notification-based replication between the sites. So that allows the inter-site replication to happen at the same 15 to 30 second interval as the intra-site replication. And I have one customer who has offices all over the world. They changed their site replication to notification-based replication, and now their entire global Active Directory converges in 37 seconds. And what that means is any change that's made anywhere in the world within an average of 37 seconds makes it to every other domain controller in the world. And as long as you have relatively decent connectivity, that's perfectly fine. Because the amount of traffic that is replicated doesn't increase that much when you use notification-based replication. The same changes have to make it across the wire. The difference is you're not waiting 15 minutes and getting a whole bunch of changes. You're getting changes as they happen, a more steady stream of small changes. So notification-based replication is another big change that I encourage you to help your employers and your enterprises understand. Any questions on sites, subnets, replication, those kinds of pieces? Okay. Now on to administrative roles. You are or you're going to be an administrator of Active Directory. It's very important that you follow the best practice of having multiple accounts. You need to have one account for you as a user, and you need to have other accounts that have privileges. And that's a very common best practice, and I hope you've all learned that. So you log on as a user without privileges, and then you use run as to run your administrative tools with higher level credentials. And if you are also a domain administrator, I encourage you to have a third account that is at that level. Because on a day-to-day basis, you don't need to be a domain administrator. You can have an administrative account that has the permissions it needs to manage users and manage groups and manage computers, and you can use that second account on a day-to-day basis. The only time you need to be a domain or an enterprise administrator is when you're making very significant changes. And so it's best to isolate that into yet a third account if you are that privileged in your organization. Now, in addition, there are certain accounts in Active Directory that already are highly privileged, of course, including the domain administrator account, the administrator account in the domain. That account is super privileged, so it is an account you really never should log on as. You can create your own account that has lots of privileges, but keep that account reserved for emergencies. I have a lot of my big clients lock it down to the point where in order to log on as the domain administrator, 2 people each have part of a password that together can be used to break into that one account and log on to it. You also have groups in Active Directory that have a lot of power. Domain administrators, enterprise admins, schema admins, and these groups should be kept empty for the most part. So let's take a quick look at these groups here. So we have domain admins, enterprise admins, schema admins also falls into this group. There's really no need for these accounts to have very many users in them. So keep them as empty as possible, and again, perhaps with special identities that you really only need when they're necessary. With the schema admins group specifically can be completely empty until the time when you need to make a schema change. And then there are some specific groups that are legacy groups that you need to watch out for. These are the built-in groups, and they all have the word operators in them. These print operators, server operators, backup operators, these accounts are highly problematic. They were put into Active Directory in order to support backward compatibility with Windows NT. They have too many privileges in Active Directory. They're over-credentialed. They don't align with business requirements today. And additionally, if you put an account in one of these groups, it becomes protected in such a way that the permissions that apply to that account are different than they would normally be. It becomes more difficult to change that account's password, and all kinds of other things happen as well. And if you want some details on exactly what I'm talking about, you can look up admin SD holder, which is the problem that happens when you add an account to these. So instead of using these groups, don't, and create your own groups that have the privileges they need to do a backup. You can give any group the right to back up a server. You can give any group the right to log on to a server. You can delegate management of user accounts. Do it with custom groups rather than using these legacy groups in Active Directory. And also, do be sure to audit changes to these groups, particularly domain admins. Windows Server now includes directory service change auditing, where you can audit exactly who added a specific user or group to domain admins and who took them out. And you want to make sure you're auditing that and keeping an eye on it. Sorry, I hit escape by accident. Okay. On the topic of user accounts, most of us, we're all familiar with user accounts, and we know that users have a logon name. The problem with the logon name is that it has to be unique within the domain, and a lot of companies don't have very good standards to ensure uniqueness. I know companies who use first name, last initial, for example, Dan H. And that becomes difficult because as soon as you have another Dan H., one user has to have a name that's not really their name. So what I encourage you to head towards is the old user logon name should be something that is unique in the domain and unique for that user, such as their employee ID. Or I have some clients who actually allow users to pick their own username, like you would on Twitter or something like that. And then you don't use that to log on. Instead, use the user principal name to log on. The user principal name is another attribute of your user account, and it has to be unique within the forest, But the advantage of the user principal name is that it looks like and it can be your email address. So if I look at one of my employees' accounts, we can see that their user logon name is adam.barr@contoso.com, which is also his email address. So that becomes very easy for users to remember. They just log on with their email address and their password. They think of it as their email address. It just happens that the user principal name is the same as their email address. Also consider renaming the administrator account. That doesn't technically add any security, but it adds manageability to so that if someone is accidentally logging on as administrator on their workstation, but they forgot to choose the local machine and they're still logging onto the domain, they don't start creating audit entries in the domain. So I do encourage you to rename the administrator account just for manageability. And then come passwords. You have users with usernames and passwords, and all of us are used to this idea of you need an 8-character password with complexity. Those 8-character or 6-character passwords with complexity aren't really that secure. And the problem with complexity is that it becomes difficult for users to remember and difficult for them to type. And one of the biggest risks for passwords is actually users having so much trouble remembering them that they write them down, right? Stick them on a Post-it note under their keyboard or on their monitor. Instead, encourage users to use phrases, to use sentences. When you do the math, a 3-word password is far more secure than a 6-character complex password. So if my password is Antwerp is fun, that's a very, very, very secure password. It's easy for me to remember, and it's easy for me to type quickly so that if someone is watching me, it's tougher for them to see what I'm doing instead of me having to hold down Control or Shift, exclamation point. So short phrases are actually more secure, more memorable, and your users will appreciate it. The other thing to think about is fine-grained password policies, which are a feature of Windows Server now, relatively new, that allow you to set more strict policies for your administrative accounts and your service accounts. Now, moving into Active Directory a little bit deeper, one of the bad practices that I see is naming users with their last name first, just so that you can see them in Active Directory. So when you look in Active Directory, users are sorted by name, and they're sorted by the first letter in their name. So if you're looking for Bill Gates, is he under B for Bill or W for William? It's kind of difficult to figure out. And so what some companies will do is they'll do last name, comma, first name. The problem with that, and this is illustrated on the slide, is that when you look under the hood at what's going on, what Active Directory stores is actually their last name / comma, because the comma is a reserved character in the distinguished name. It separates the components of this distinguished name. So if you have a comma in the name, it has to be escaped. And that makes it tough to work with scripts and tough to work with other things. So instead of doing last name, comma, first name for the username, we'll find another solution for that, which is to customize the MMC view. So we can go into our views, let's take employees for example, and we can simply add the last name column so that when we need to sort by last name, whoops, I added the wrong column, sorry. We want last name, surname. So when we want to find a user by last name, we can simply sort by that column to find them more effectively. Now, it is okay to have the display name be last, comma, first. So the display name, which it shows up in the Exchange global address list, for example, that's totally fine. It's the common name of the object, which is how the object is listed here, that you do not want to use last name, comma, first name. Now, when we added the last name column, we actually exposed another problem with the tool set, which is when I added the last name column to the employees OU, it also adds the last name column to every other view. So now I see a last name column for my computers, which probably isn't very helpful. So we're going to need to fix that as well. But that's an option for us. Now, the last 15 minutes of this session, I want to start moving into things you can do to actually administer Active Directory more effectively. This takes us into a concept that I call extreme MMC consoles. So the MMC console, as I'm sure you know, is the framework within which administrative tools snap in Windows. So if you open an empty MMC console, you can start adding snap-ins. And you can say, okay, I need Active Directory users and computers. I need group policy management. I need, let's say, DFS management. And you can create your own tools. Now, by doing this, you can create a single console that you can save. And when you need to run your administrative tools, you open that one console. It has all the tools you need. And of course, you need to open it with your administrative credentials. So you do that one time. Instead of every time you need to launch a tool, having to enter a new set of username and passwords for your administrative credentials, just have one console with all of your tools in it. So it makes it easier to run as an administrator if you have all your tools in one place. And what we see here is a console that I built, and you can see there are a lot of snap-ins that I've added. Active Directory, Group Policy, several other Active Directory tools, ADSI, DNS, everything is here in one place. So this is how I administer an environment like the Olympics, for example. So you add your consoles in, and then it allows you to log on one time as your administrative account, that's much more secure and manageable for your environment. And then in the slides, which you'll be able to download, there are some pointers about how to work with these consoles more effectively. I'm not going to detail this right now just because of time. I do want to show you a couple of tricks in the console, the first of which is the link to web address snap-in. And the link to web address snap-in is designed to show you a website. So if you go to add the snap-in, we find link to web address, click add, and we put in a URL, and that will then create a node in the console that shows a web page, which might be helpful if we have documentation that we want to incorporate into the MMC or an intranet site that we want to expose in the MMC. But keep in mind that your MMC console is running as an administrator, so you don't necessarily want to be going out to BitTorrent and downloading things from this particular web page because it will be running with your administrative credentials. Now, one of the tricks that is not very well documented about this snap-in is that you can add a UNC path. So, for example, I can create a path to //server01/data to a share, and what that does is it creates a node that exposes the share in the MMC console. Now think about why this is helpful. If I am not in my console and I try to go to that share, I'm connecting to this share as my user account. And my user account probably doesn't have permissions to do what I need it to do in this share. And Windows Explorer doesn't let you run a window in Explorer with different credentials. You can only be running one set of credentials in Windows Explorer. But the console is running as administrator, as my administrative account. So now I can do things like set permissions and all of that within my administrative console with this link to web address snap-in. So that's a really nice, handy way to work with being able to connect to a server as an administrator. In addition, you want to start using saved queries. Now, saved queries are a way of virtualizing your complex environment. So we already saw how complex this environment is. We have all these different OUs with the different computers. We've got user accounts split between contractors and employees. And most Windows administrators are focused on OUs when they do administration. And they constantly have to navigate down into their environment to find the right account, and it's tough to find things. Instead, I encourage you to never use your OUs. Instead, create saved queries. Saved queries allow you to create a view based on any criteria. So for example, I have a view of all computers in my environment. It doesn't matter which OU they're in, it's just all computers. So I can quickly find a computer by name without having to go deep into my OU structure. So saved queries allow you to create a view, for example, all users, all computers, all groups. You can also use saved queries to create reports. So if my manager wants me to report users that haven't logged on in 90 days, I can actually create a saved query to do that. I can create a new query. We'll call it users who haven't logged on in 90 days. And then I can go define the query, and I can pick 90 days since last logon. So you can create reports, and then you can export these reports straight from the MMC console with the export. Actually, no, it's further down here. We can create other types of views that show us a subset of our environment. So this is a view that shows me administrative accounts. This shows me a certain type of set of groups. So I can create very nice virtual views of my environment, and then I can administer the objects from there without having to worry about how complex my OU structure actually is. Does that make sense? Okay. One of the other benefits of saved queries is that the columns that are visible are per saved query. So you remember I pointed out the problem with the last name column that then got added to computers? That doesn't happen in saved queries. In saved queries, I can have a different set of columns for computers and a different set of columns for users. So I can get very specific and give myself the information that I need in order to administer my environment correctly. So saved queries have a lot of benefits, and the slide deck steps you through some of the things that I was just showing you. Now, the final tip that I want to give you related to working effectively as an administrator is how to bring commands that you need into the tools that you use. Let's start with a really sort of simple example, which is, as administrators, we often want to remote desktop to another machine. That's very, very common. And we know we can pull up the remote desktop console and we can type in all kinds of information and we can connect to another machine. But it would be nice to be able to right-click in Active Directory and say, connect me to that machine. We can do that as long as we have a command that supports a variable. So for example, the mstsc command is the command that allows us to connect with remote desktop from the command line. It takes a switch /v:, and then the computer name. It takes a variable. Knowing that, we can create that command in our console. And let me show you how that works. And what I'm going to show you is documented in the slide deck. So when you want to try this, the instructions are all there. What we do is we create what's called a task pad. We create a new task pad view. So I'm going to create a view. We'll call it Antwerp Computers. And then, once you've created the task pad view, you get this area on the left that we can fill with tasks. And we fill those tasks by editing the task pad view, and on the Tasks tab, creating a new task. And the type of task you want to create is called a shell command. And again, don't worry too much about the steps. They are in the slides. And the shell command, this is where the magic happens. Here are the command and the parameters. So our command is mstsc.exe. Our parameters are /v:, and then the computer name. And the way we insert the variable of the computer name is by clicking this button and choosing name. Now Windows does the rest. It does this for us, and you don't have to worry about that. That's hard-coded. It's done automatically. And now we've got the command, the parameter, and this variable of the name of the computer. With that task, we give it a friendly name. Let's call it Remote Desktop. We pick an icon. And when we're all done, we can pick a computer. And notice when I pick a computer, my task appears here. And this task will run that command, and the variable will be the name of that computer. I'm not sure I actually have remote desktop enabled on that server. We'll cancel that. But you can see that it's working. Now you take that further and you can add all kinds of tasks to your console to give you things that you need done. So here's one that we'll show you as well. Opening the C drive and opening a remote command prompt. It's common that you want to be able to connect to the C drive of a machine when you're trying to support it. The way we add that task is we create, again, a new shell command. The command is going to be, hopefully I can remember this, explorer.exe. And then the parameters are \\\, the computer name, \C:. Now I'm doing this off the top of my head. I might actually not have this perfect. But we insert the variable into the command that we want to execute. Oh, shoot. Well, since I messed that up, let's look at the right one to be sure. C drive. This is the one I pre-created. Yep, that was the right command. So once we've got that, we again can pick a computer. When we pick a computer, the tasks we've created light up, and we can open that computer's C drive straight from Explorer, and or straight from the MMC. And another good example is a remote command prompt. Now, hopefully you've heard of the tool PSExec. PSExec is a great tool from Mark Rusinovich, who is now back at Microsoft. You can get it from TechNet. It's free. And you can use PSExec to run a command on a remote machine. And we'll do a simple example of this, which is, and since we're running short on time, I'm just going to show you the preset. PSExec.exe \\, the computer name, cmd.exe. So this command will run PSExec on the remote machine, and we can then do anything we need on that machine. So just to show you how that works, I click the task. It opens up PSExec, and PSExec is kind of like remote desktop, except it's remote command prompt. So I'm now starting a command prompt that actually is running on that machine, Contoso DC. And assuming that it works here, I can prove to you that I'm on that machine by typing the command hostname, and that shows me that I am, in fact, on Contoso DC. So any command that you have that can accept a variable, you can add as a task. So I've got things like ipconfig/all, shutdown/restart, mstsc, and gpupdate.exe. I've got all kinds of things that can take variables or that can be used with PSExec that I can do to a single machine in my environment straight from within my tool set. So hopefully this helps you see that you can take tools that you've got and commands that you've learned and put them right at your fingertips so that they're much easier to use and much more discoverable, and you don't have to go diving into your start menu every time you need to administer your systems. Now, the final thing I'll leave you with is the idea that there are often tools that you need to load as an administrator that are truly outside of the normal tool set. There are things you need to run as an administrator like the command prompt itself. A lot of times you just need to open up a command prompt as an administrator. Let me show you a great way to do that within these MMC consoles. You can add, I should say, a folder snap-in, which you can then rename. I'm just going to call it Antwerp. So I've just added this folder snap-in, and I'm going to create a task pad out of that folder, and I'm going to create what's called a no-list task pad, which basically just gives me a big blank window. So that all I've done is create a task pad with nothing in it. I'm now going to edit that task pad, and I'm going to add any command that I as an administrator want to be able to run as an administrator. So as a simple example, cmd.exe, all by itself. Command prompt. And I can even go pick the icon cmd.exe. So now I can launch this, And because the console is already running as an administrator, anything I launch from the taskpad will also be running as an administrator. So we can see it is in fact running as administrator. So there's some great things you can do with the tools that Microsoft has given us that they don't document particularly well that allow you to administer your environments much more effectively. Saved queries with custom columns, task pads that bring tools in, and finally there is, of course, PowerShell, which opens up all kinds of additional capabilities for automating. And PowerShell can also be brought into this framework, and you can be launching commands that, in fact, start a PowerShell session. So, for example, I can start an interactive PowerShell session on this computer. So hopefully this inspired you to start looking outside the box with the tools that you have as a Windows administrator. Just as a quick reminder, my email address, my Twitter handle, I'm always here to answer questions for you. The tools that I've shown you, I will put into a zip file and post later on this week, so they will be up there for you. And I hope that you've really enjoyed Students to Business 2011. Thank you guys very much for coming, and I look forward to following your success as Active Directory administrators. Thank you very much.